Hello lovelies, so today we're going to be reviewing and flipping through Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. This is the less fancy edition. The fancier edition had a different cover and I don't know what else. But this is the less fancy edition. This is a setting book as well as an adventure, something which I approve of as it increases the replayability and the use and reference of this, as I think I was talking about in my Sword Coast review. This seems to be the way that they're going, in that they have an adventure set within an area, and then along with that adventure they have setting information for that area overall. And this is a good way to go. Adventures are always a hard sell, so any additional material and value that you can put into them makes things work. And I think they have the balance closer to right, but still too much adventure compared to setting information for it truly to be the value of what it costs, unfortunately. You get a lovely poster map, which I haven't taken out because I might be giving this away. That adds value in the same way old sort of tear out cards and things that you had in old school adventures added value. But yeah, nice poster maps, always nice. But I would strongly suggest that you laminate your poster maps and things that you get with any of these games, because pizza happens, coffee happens, blims from spliffs happen, and stuff gets ruined pretty easily. So if you can get it laminated, I'd strongly suggest doing so, and that way it'll last. Now, a lot of particularly 5th edition D&D material ends up feeling incredibly generic, as in, like, not only is anything permitted, but everything is mandatory. So no matter what the setting, no matter what the place, you have to have every fantasy race, and you have to have every aspect of every human race present in every place. And that does happen here. It is kind of jarring. It would have been nicer if they created a true northern culture based on, say, Norse myths, or the Lapps, or the Sami, Finnish culture, all of that. That kind of stuff does appear in the background in some of the monsters and so on, but less so in the actual settlements, less so in the adventure particularly. And it's unfortunate. But I guess if you have to choose between being accused of cultural appropriation or being accused of inappropriate multiculturalism at the cost of representation of minority cultures, I guess in the current environment the decision makes sense, but it does kind of undermine itself to an extent, I would say. And there's a disjunct between the settlements and the culture and the creatures and the environment and so on. That said, the environment plays an enormous role in Icewind Dale, and that's reflected in the art, which is much less busy. It has much more time to breathe and to evoke the setting, rather than necessarily all being fixated on action or the characters. Yeah, it takes its time. Like this wonderful piece here just shows a frozen ship at a frozen dock. There's no dragons, there's no fighting, there's no magic going off. Yeah, the setting has a chance to breathe. It's less of a breakneck pace. It's more evocative for that. But because the setting is so frozen, so difficult, because survival is such a thing, this setting is much more powerful, almost a character in and of itself, than the genericized settings on the Sword Coast and so on are. But it does create that disjunct. But if you wanted to create or to set a game within the Frozen North yourself, and you wanted to pay more attention to northern cultures and representations thereof and inspiration taken from, you could easily lift all the good stuff out of this and put it into a genuine, meaningful Frozen North setting of your own. but this definitely suffers from the homogeneous nature of so much 5th edition material. It's just that the setting is so strong that it helps counteract some of that boring homogeneity that you otherwise get in a lot of settings. What is this guy doing here? Right? I know people are going to say accusations of racism or whatever else, but you don't allow the North to shine. You don't allow the cultures of the North to shine when you genericize everything, when you include everything without appeal to rhyme or reason. Rhyme, ha ha ha, Rime of the Frostmaiden. Without appeal to rhyme or reason or plausibility or helping people to a sense of suspension of disbelief. So you get a lot of material on the settings, on the wilderness, on the settlements that are there. That's good, but not the best part of the book. As I say, it's all rather generic. You will see everything you would expect to see in a 5th edition Forgotten Realms book, adventure, Dragonlord. You know, they've just got to cram absolutely everything in there, and so it suffers for that. And it only really has room to be itself when it comes to monsters or survival rules, wilderness survival, travel, and so on. Goliaths are a bit of an exception. They kind of have an interesting culture, and they're meant to come from this area, so that makes a bit more sense. That works a bit better. But really, the settlements are where it's at its weakest, because they have to include everything, and you don't really get a sense of the culture being different. But the environment, again, as I say, almost being a character in and of itself, to an extent compensates for and overrides that problem. Now, a large amount of the book is an adventure, and it's hard to review adventures without spoiling anything. Everything is kind of already spoiled because so many different streamed games run the official modules that it creates a common culture and a common knowledge of the adventures and the ins and outs and the traps and the byways and so on, that it becomes almost impossible to tell who's metagaming and who isn't. Now, in the old school days, modules were a common touchstone between different groups, because different groups would play through the adventures. And then if you met up at the game store or a convention, that was where you got a sense of commonality and culture, you know, exchanging stories about modules, or, you know, showing off the scars that you got from the Tomb of Annihilation or whatever else. That kind of faded with the rise of the internet. In that we had a constant common gaming culture and community. But adventures as touchstones seems to have come back with the advent of streamed games being so popular, particularly Critical Role and so on. But there's so many other streamed games out there, and so many of them use the official modules that they have again become a common touchstone between different groups. But it also means that everyone knows what's coming, unfortunately. Now, the adventure path in this is interesting in that you have your main quest line, but you also have a whole smattering of side quests and so on. It's structured much more like a computer game, where there is that main quest line, but you have a limited amount of capacity to wander, to do side quests and side adventures, and to deal with other things as you're going along. Whereas most of the 5th edition adventures are much more sort of straight line railroad, combat scene, kind of like they were for 4th edition. So it's welcome here, but it's still not really entirely open. It's guided. It's a broader railroad with more branches, but at the end of the day, it's still a railroad. Still, that's an improvement, and it's something to be encouraged that we see from Rime of the Frostmaiden. So you've got a limited amount of free roaming capability here. Yeah, that's good. The adventures and the locations themselves, they're a mixture of things that make a kind of sense internally within the context of the game and the adventures and what might actually be living in any of these places. But there's also a mix of lol so random Gygaxian stuff as well, and that doesn't land quite so well in the modern day, given our current sensibilities, which is a shame in some ways, because Gygaxian nonsense can be a lot of fun. You know, random dungeons. One room contains a Medusa, the next room contains a goblin with a jingly hat. Yeah, there's no rhyme or reason to anything. But here it's a weird juxtaposition, especially given the survival-oriented toughness of living and adventuring and working within this environment. You'd want a bit more verisimilitude, I think. And so the Gygaxian stuff just seems a bit too odd, or like a random comedy encounter from something like Fallout. You know, for example, there are mind flayers, illithids, but most of them are cute little illithids, and it's a bit overly sci-fi. Not to diss Spelljammer or anything, but it just feels a little bit also random, out of place, Gygaxian here, in a way that other stuff doesn't. And yeah, and like I said, it's that juxtaposition of the two that's a bit odd, I guess. Now, in terms of reusability, obviously the settlement information is useful, the survival information is useful, the environmental information is useful, the map obviously is very useful if you want to set further adventures in the north. By the settlements, I mean the physical nature of the settlements, not so much the people who are there, because that's all homogeneous grey pap, unfortunately. But the rest of it, there is a lot of stuff that you can use, particularly the monsters, the ice-themed monsters, the Goliaths and their culture, which is as close to you get to a genuine northern culture in all of this. Again, I would have preferred to see northern cultural reference points playing into and drawing inspiration from the Inuit, the Sami, the Siberian tribes, the Lapps, people like that, and that's just not here. Closest you get is probably the Goliaths. Excuse me. And that's okay, but the real reusability value here largely comes from the monsters and the races and so on that you can import, like the Goliaths, into your games elsewhere. The adventure itself is pretty standard fare for the most part. There's a couple of plot twists. Again, you can't really review an adventure without spoiling it. The main thing that I'm left with is that main adventure with side quests is a good compromise in a way to present adventures, that the artwork and so on is much more evocative and the layout is far less tortured than a lot of their other materials. That's good. The presentation's good. The reusability is higher than a lot of their other adventure paths that I've reviewed. But the main reusability is pretty much with the monsters. Though I was disappointed that there weren't any leopard seals, because leopard seals are cool. Watch some YouTube videos on them. They're proper predators. You get some magic items. You get some over-the-top magical locations. You get quite a few random tables. Again, there's a kind of disjunct between the randomness in character creation and so on, and some of these items, and the more serious tone that they normally feel like they're taking. He says on a page with a giant penguin monster, but if you've read your Lovecraft, at the Mountains of Madness needs a nod. The Thing gets a bit of a nod here and there as well, but including references just for the sake of it is like including illithid UFOs just for the sake of it. It just feels a bit off, a bit too obvious. Magic items are always useful. Monsters are always useful. Those are the things you can reuse the most. And honestly, while this adventure path is good enough that I would be tempted to run it myself as an ongoing game series at some point, the real value, I think, is in tearing out the good bits and using them in your own frosty northern setting. Unfortunately, I feel like we're kind of repeating the mistakes that were made in the 3rd edition days, when games and settings that just weren't really suited to D&D, and that's even more so these days when it comes to 5th edition. These rules are really only really useful for D&D, but people keep trying to cram them into other things, like a harsh environment where you have to focus on your survival is softened and deadened by the sheer amount of healing magic and protection and so on, so it rapidly becomes not a factor. And people are making games like Carbon, or Iron Kingdoms is releasing a 5th edition version of their setting when they should be supporting the Iron Kingdoms RPG. Everyone seems to be chasing that Dungeons and Dragons buck when system matters, and if your system and setting work in synergy, you end up with a much better game. And in this, I feel like the setting is constantly struggling against the 5th edition rules, which don't really allow you to play a gritty sort of survival game so much. And it also suffers from the homogeneity of 5th edition, where everything has to be included no matter what, and that has a quite massively deleterious effect on the effectiveness of presenting the setting. Style, it's a lot better presented than a lot of other 5th edition D&D material. It's a lot more clearly presented in the text, and the setting is allowed to breathe in given room. Obviously, you expect more from Wizards of the Coast. You expect a higher standard of art, and so on. Even so, I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 5 for style, because it's really been moving in the right direction. And for substance as well, I'm going to give it 4 out of 5, because there's a lot more reusable stuff here. I probably won't give this one away. I might actually run it at some point. And I will certainly use it as a reference tool when I'm creating stuff for 5th edition. So in terms of substance, I also have to give it a 4 out of 5. It's moving in the right direction. Still too much adventure compared to other information, but the adventures are more broad. The information is more broad. There's more stuff that's reusable. So that's 8 out of 10 or 4 out of 5 stars. Well worth it, this one, if you play 5th edition D&D at all. Zang. Bitch. Where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me, J. Desborough.